Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll get started. This story is about a girl who had incredibly soft and fair skin, like white winter snow. She also had dazzlingly long hair that looked like silver threads. Also, this beautiful, mysterious girl had blue eyes, in which there was not a single gram of surprise, as if the celebration did not concern her at all. Her name was Ivette Winchester. Years later, the Winchester family held their daughter's coming-of-age ceremony, and she was once again the center of people's attention. Unmarried men were at a loss for words. They could not even say 2 words in her presence, and the wives there had to endure a real test of fidelity. Yes, and their wives too were enraptured by this beautiful Annette, which attracted the attention of absolutely every man. Yay! In just one night, the girl who combined greatness, wealth, and beauty became the most discussed personality in the capital's society. There were even rumors that her future husband would become the next ruler of the empire. All the guests were ready to bow their heads before her, because she really was just an incredible person. And when this news also reached the imperial family, this girl disappeared like an annual flower that disappears after its time. And so it has been months since poor Annette disappeared. A maid was walking through the palace to deliver a very important message. As soon as she entered the lady's office, she bowed immediately and said that a letter had come to her. The woman who sat at her desk, who was the Duchess of Winchester, her name was Eloise, and she inquired in surprise, "Are they asking about Annette again?" When the maid nodded in agreement, the woman said with a heavy sigh that this had been going on for a very long time and she was sick of it all. She took a pen in her hand to sign some papers. The maid replied that this message had been sent from the imperial house. Eloise wondered. Then she wondered, what does it even say? Then the maid replied that the Empress was asking her not to forget her past feelings. As soon as the woman heard this, she was so surprised and angry at the same time that she even broke her pen. With a heavy sigh, the Duchess asked the maid for a new pen. She bowed and said she would bring it to her in a moment. Afterward, the woman was alone and thought about something she needed to write, and it was pretty important. Soon after, she went to the window and saw that their estate was once again incredibly crowded, and it was indeed true. In fact, the imperial palace was constantly inquiring about the new identity. Someone said that the young duchess had been bullied by her family since childhood, and thus had to work hard to at least earn her food. Others said that the lady was suffering from an incurable disease, and if even a ray of sunlight fell on her, her skin would evaporate in an instant. Still other people speculate that the lady has been cursed, and as soon as she leaves the grounds of the house, she is bound to turn into green smoke and scatter to the wind. All of these rumors were, of course, embellished to a fairly large extent. The beautiful Annette had incredibly beautiful but weak and unstained skin, and she never disappeared anywhere. She stayed in her room all the time. Of course, all these rumors were not justified, because the girl just did not want to go anywhere, and all the time sat at home. After Eloise read the letter, she immediately went to her daughter's room with the maid, and they woke her up in a rather unusual way. The maid struck large, loud cymbals against each other for Annette to wake up, and it did happen. She looked incredibly sleepy, but the maid said it was time for her to eat. She didn't stay home because she was sick or something was wrong with her. She was just spoiled. Ever since she was a little girl, Annette had been looked after very reverently by everyone, and not even Leia or her, and was always given only what she liked. And when the girl got bored with some food, even her father would rebuke her about it and tell her that he could finish the rest and she shouldn't worry about it. Annette moved independently, only for a distance of no more than 20 meters, after which she always asked for her father's arms. And in the end, she turned into a person who had to be walked, given special food, and could only open her mouth to eat. And she didn't even want to dress herself. Everyone in that house called her just a lowlife and lazy, but Annette was no longer surprised by anything. She was used to such a life, so she could not give it up. As soon as the mother woke her daughter, the daughter sighed heavily and said that perhaps that was why her father had chosen her brother. But after a moment's thought, she realized that she couldn't be blamed for anything, because it was all her fault anyway for allowing this behavior. And while she was telling her daughter all this, she even started to fall asleep again. Eloise was very angry, and she started to shout at her, telling her to listen carefully. When they did manage to wake her up again, Mother came closer to her and asked her if she even knew how things were outside. Some people from the Imperial Palace even organized a special operation to rescue her from her room. Of course, Annette didn't answer anything to that either. She just sat and looked at her mother. Eloise then sat down beside her on the bed and said that if she could fully protect her, that would be just fine. However, ever since her father left them, she's just had to take charge of everything herself. And if it weren't for the internet, of course, she'd have a hard time of it. She smiled at her daughter and wondered how the girl would live alone if Louise ever died. But Annette said nothing to this. She only began to cry hard. Then her mother thanked her for this and asked her if she was saying things that were too hurtful. The woman then turned to all the servants who had already made it and said that it was time for them to pack up. She said they should put down the patchwork quilt, gold coins, and bring as many winter clothes as possible. Eloise explained that looks weren't that important at all. The important thing was that they didn't get cold. But then suddenly Annette grabbed her mom's hand and wondered where she wanted to send her. The woman smiled, surprised, and asked if she hadn't told her that. But seeing her daughter's surprised and concerned look, she pulled out the letter and said she had found someone she could trust. In fact, there was an order of lions in their empire. It was a ghost army that consisted of war orphans and exiles who were not recognized by the royal family. Their name alone already instills fear in everyone from the royal family to even the common people. But their leader, Victor Bovad, was a particularly formidable man. Some even talk of him making a deal with the devil in order to obtain an invulnerable body. Many of the servants were horrified at what they heard, for they did not understand how she could suppose Miss Ivette would be safe in such a place. However, Eloise talked about how these were just silly rumors, so they shouldn't worry. The butler, who had served the Winchester family in contented years, had never questioned their orders. This time, however, he was simply terrified. The man took off his work gloves and, falling to his knees, began to hug the lady's leg, saying that if she really insisted on sending the lady away, he would weep and protest. Eloise, sighing heavily, said that she had already sent the letter 3 days ago, so it should have reached the addressee by now, and there was definitely no turning back. The butler looked at her angrily and wondered if she would at least move the guards away from the lady's room in that case. The Duchess wondered if it was really necessary, but when she saw the look in his eyes, she knew he wouldn't leave her side, so she told him he could do whatever he wanted. The man was immediately glad when he heard this, and thanked her ladyship for her discretion. Thereupon he went out of the door. In fact, all the other servants were also incredibly happy, and Eloise was very surprised by this, and the maid told her to remember that the servant's behavior could affect Lady Ivette. But the woman replied not to worry too much about it. They could have a little fun and enjoy themselves before she left. After that, she reflected on the situation in the country. King Pierce was simply in a critical condition. The first prince, the official heir, and the second prince, supported by the queen, are both desperate to expand their influence. Vette's coming-of-age ceremony is caught up in this conflict, and right at that moment, the entire capital is watching to see which side the Winchesters will take. However, as long as an in this has the power of a princess, regardless of her wishes, she will inevitably fall victim to political struggles. David, who was the butler, served this family much more than the maid who served Eloise. Therefore, the Duchess said that he couldn't help but understand the whole situation. So this was only the best way to appease the servants. Then she also said that she was actually incompetent herself, for after all, she would not have succeeded in getting the duchy without the Queen's help. He can only hope that while Lady Ivette is away, the Queen will find another candidate for marriage. By then the maid had gone to the window and saw that a multitude of horses and a wagon were approaching their estate, and Eloise replied that she had known and trusted Victor for a long time, and if Annette hid in his castle, it would be good for him. But then suddenly, she remembered the rumors that had been going around the community, and turning to the maid, she asked if David had told her about this girl. Well, of course, the butler told everything at once, poor Annette, and she, sitting in her room, was already terrified of what the future held in store for her. David said he was 2 meters tall, his legs were as thick as wood, and he could crush the heads of 2 children with one hand. And so, as the girl sat in her room, completely covered with a blanket and hoping for the best, the door suddenly opened. She immediately heard the voices of some of the servants and moved closer to the doors because they asked to do so. One of the maids said that the Order of Lions had come to take her away, so this was her last chance to escape. She handed the girl a rope and a book, saying that in this way they were expressing their care and love for Annette, and added that they supported whatever decision she made. The servants immediately advised her not to give up, so she was not to be discouraged. But as soon as Annette saw the rope, all she could think of was that she could make a hook to hang herself with, and when the workers of the house saw this, they immediately said that this was not what they were talking about at all. So after that, the girl started to read the book they had given her. It was called 100 Questions About the Noble Lady's Escape. As soon as Annette opened it, it said that if she was reading this, she was in a difficult situation because of her parents' will, or she is frustrated because she can't get out of the situation. When Annette read this introduction, she was delighted, because it described her situation clearly. The book was said to contain the personal experiences of hundreds of noble ladies who had left home. And it also describes the method of escape and all the necessary information a noble lady might need when escaping. The first point was that if the front door was locked, the only way was to escape through the balcony. A sturdy rope should be an excellent guide to the outside world. But it also said that running away was only the first step in her adventure. She would also need skills and abilities to improve her chances of survival. She had to learn how to identify poisonous herbs, heal minor wounds, hunt, and interracial communicate. Annette had to know about building small towns, conquering ancient monsters, and even training an army. She could learn in this book about how to start the Age of Discovery and take over territories and even rule them. But as soon as Annette read about all this, she closed the book immediately. There were too many words in it that she didn't want to just read. So she went out to the balcony to refresh her thoughts a bit and put the plan into action. The girl tied the rope at the top and threw it down so she could get out. Thus, sticking to her virtuous purpose, she decided to return to that book a little later when she had more inspiration. This is how the Princess Duchess set out on her new and more interesting adventure. The girl untied the rope from her waist and began to climb down. However, her adventure ended without even starting, because she ran straight into the man she was supposed to run over. Because the rope the servants had given her was quite old, it could not bear the strain and began to tear. If Victor hadn't been nearby, she might have fallen and even hurt herself. However, because he was standing at the bottom, he managed to grab her. For a while they just stood there looking at each other, not saying a single word. And at that moment, a simply brilliant thought visited the lovely head of the princess. She sat in his arms and wondered if he was their new guardian. The man was a little surprised at such a question and wondered what she meant. But Annette only asked that he carry her to the gate, for she was running away from home. But then suddenly her eyes, which were just incredibly beautiful, began to close. And as she fell asleep, she said that walking with her feet was too tiring, so she would be incredibly grateful to him. That's how awkward and rather interesting their first meeting was, which they will remember for the rest of their lives. At this very time, chaos was going on in the city, with people running from side to side and shouting that the Order of Lions had arrived, so they had to flee. And soon the crowd of people immediately scattered to their homes, abandoning even the food they had bought at the market. The man named Arthur Orange, who was the vice captain of the Order of Lions, smiled happily and said that apparently their reputation was pretty well known in this city. He was very pleased and said it was good to know. When Frances, who was a swordsman, spoke, she told them to put their energies into finding some food. Also, a man who was in their gang and was a barbarian said she should speak a little softer. See, their co-workers. His name was Hark Benson. He went to one door to open it and said they were always misunderstood, just because they were all yelling so much. As soon as he opened the door, he immediately saw a little boy. He looked quite frightened. Hark turned to him and told him not to be afraid, for all was well, and also inquired if his mother was at home. The boy immediately started screaming and crying loudly, asking that the guy not eat his mommy. Leeds came up behind him. He was a beastman as well as a warrior, and told the boy not to be upset, for he thought he had a pretty face. He explained that it was a kind of reckless beauty, so he shouldn't be so afraid of it all. Fried's Gustav turned to face at that moment. He was an alchemist, and said that it was a pretty good attempt. However, he better not even try to comfort anyone next time. Arthur, putting under a tree, turned to them all, and inquired whether their reputations would not have been much better if the captain had accepted the king's offer. Francis replied that he knew that the commander hated those aristocrats. I'd better complain now too, because it wouldn't do any good anyway. But Arthur continued to be indignant and said that was why it was all so strange. He hated them, yet now he suddenly came to see the princess. He asked Francis if she thought it was rather odd to separate from the main squad and go to the duchy. The rest of the team, upon reflection, said that he was indeed right, and that it was rather suspicious and strange. But then, suddenly, Hark, who had sat down on the curb and started peeling himself an apple, wondered what they thought of this strange thing, since he was normally so old to be married, and certainly didn't require their permission to do so. As soon as they all heard this, they looked at the man in surprise and asked what it was he was saying. The guy was suddenly startled and asked if he had said something wrong, but they were actually surprised not by his words, but by what was going on behind his back. In fact, just behind appeared just their captain, who was carrying this girl in his arms. And the rest of the team, seeing this, immediately began to smile and look expectantly at their captain. The man came closer and didn't understand why they were suddenly looking at him like that. But at that moment, servants ran out of the palace. David was walking ahead of everyone, and when he saw Victor carrying the princess in his arms, he asked what they were doing. Butler started yelling at Annette, asking how she could sneak away and also be so close to the man she had just met. The girl, who had just woken up, answered nothing to this, and the butler asked how she could let a stranger take her in his arms. The girl then looked up in surprise at the man in whose arms she lay, and inquired who he was. Her voice was rather harsh. Guy, putting the girl back, said that he was Victor and was also captain of the Order of Lions, and at the request of the Duchess of Winchester, he was going to provide a safe place for the princess. But as soon as he said the name of his order, Annette only looked at him in surprise. The word combination was like persimmon juice and cheese slices, so she could not understand what he was talking about. The guy got very angry afterward and said that he was in the Order of Lions, so she shouldn't be twisted by their names like that. But by then her mother had already run outside and immediately ran up to Annette, hugging her. Eloise was ready to cry and said that she was incredibly glad that the girl was all right, because she had already thought that the girl had actually run away from home. She then came close to the order and apologized to them for witnessing such a scene, you see. Before that, she started scolding her a lot. Victor was a little surprised at what he saw, for Eloise had pulled her daughter's cheeks so that they were now incredibly sore. Then Francis came up behind him and whispered to him that he should tell her it was all right or something, because it was too awkward then. But the Duchess ignored the whisper, though she heard what she said, and turning to Mabel, requested that she take the lady to change her attire. The woman also said that she still needed to have a private word with Captain Victor, so she asked that the maid do so as soon as possible. Soon afterward, the Duchess went with Victor to the garden, and there their servants brought tea. The woman was the first to start a conversation and said that she had heard recently that when he returned to the capital, he was even greeted by the first prince. Many say that he hoped that the Order of Lions would become the official army of the royal family, so she was going to congratulate him on that. The woman said becoming an official knight is not only an honor, but also a generous annual stipend. Duchess said that she thought it was a big deal for the Order of Lions, but Victor interrupted her, saying that they had turned down the offer. He explained that members of the Order of Lions seek justice and would never become puppets of the royal family, even for a lot of money. He also added that they don't really need financial support, because thanks to the lands she gave them, they are still able to support themselves. Victor also said that he would be sure to repay her soon. They were silent for a while, and then Eloise, setting her cup on the table, smiled. She was very glad and said that her opinion of him was right after all. Afterwards, she asked him what his first impression of the prince was. Victor said that the first prince is quite honest, has outstanding analytical skills, and is also well-versed in battle tactics. Eloise smiled and said that she was quite interested to hear how he was seen by those who were not yet familiar with him. She also told Victor that if what she was about to say spread, it would be a real disaster for the Order of Lions and even the Winchesters. That was why she really hoped he would keep this conversation a secret. The man looked quite serious and said that of course he understood her. Then Eloise said that in 2 years the Winchesters would team up with the Queen to organize a coup d'etat. This would be done to help the second prince ascend the throne, and such an act was punishable by death. The woman knew it well, but said it didn't matter if they succeeded or not. The important thing was to try. Duchess said that she really wanted him to protect Annette and promised that she would be safe. By then, the rest of his crew had been brought into the manor and told they could rest until the lady was ready. As soon as they entered the room, they immediately started looking around all sides because everything looked luxurious. Arthur couldn't believe that all these things really belonged to the lady. Frances moved closer to the exhibits and said that she even had oriental blades. The maid smiled happily and said that surely all of these belonged to Inez and asked if they wanted her to show the blades up close. The whole team immediately got excited and said that of course they wanted to admire them. While the maid retrieved the weapon, Arthur looked around and said that she was indeed worthy to be called the princess of the duchy. He also added that lady must have traveled a lot to collect all these precious things. The maid, hearing these words, suddenly became very sad and said in a quiet voice that Lady Inez had not been anywhere since she was 5 years old. Arthur, laughing a little nervously, said that he had known that noble ladies did not wish to leave the capital. But the maid interrupted him, saying that the lady had never left home. When the members of the order heard this, they were very surprised. They just couldn't believe that she had really stayed at home all the time. The maid explained that when the princess was 5 years old, they lost her during the festival. It later turned out that the guards were in cahoots with the bandits, and they had just kidnapped the poor little lady for ransom. Unfortunately, the guards were killed on the spot because otherwise things could have ended very badly. At that moment, the maid made a single professional movement with her blade, and all the members of the order were immediately startled. However, the maid did not do anything bad to them, but only hid the weapon back in the case, saying that everything ended up safely at the end. The princess, however, has never left the manor since because of shock. She, handing the gun to Arthur, said it was all a bribe. She had watched the girl grow up, and countless times imagined how she would overcome her fears and ultimately be happy. But the maid could never even think that she might not be there for her. So she really asked the order members to take good care of Lady Annette instead of herself. Soon afterward, the maid went to the girl's room and, opening the doors, inquired if she had already changed her clothes. But Annette was nowhere to be seen. So the maid, after going around the room a few times, immediately began calling for her. Suddenly, as she passed the bookshelves, she saw something moving there. As she got closer, a lady jumped out at the maid. When the maid saw this, she was very frightened. Then she took an internet assignment and started pulling out of the mountain of books that were scattered on the floor. The girl inquired of the princess what it was that she was doing, for she had heard a still very loud sound before. In fact, before that, Annette was reaching for some book on the highest shelf. But as soon as the maid showed her fighting skills, the girl was very frightened, and because of that, she fell down. When the princess told all this to the maid, that is, she immediately became very ashamed and apologized to her for it. Annette got to her feet and held out her red and black covered book, asking that she help her return this to Martha. The maid did not immediately realize who Martha was, but then she asked if it was true that she was the maid who had helped her escape from the house. The maid immediately nodded in agreement. But as soon as the maid saw the cover of this book, she was very surprised and laughed nervously and said that Martha must have taken it by mistake. Seeing the surprised face and at this, the girl explained that this book did not belong to the maid, but to her own father. Soon after, the maid went into another room and couldn't believe that really someone had given her a book about how a noble lady should escape. One of the house staff who sorted through the books in the library said that despite its name, it contains a lot of information about biology and geography. He explained that it was one of the most comprehensive and interesting encyclopedias he had ever seen. The maid started leafing through the book and said that I should have sent the lady an encyclopedia, for she was not the sort to go out of the house, so I'd better give her some novel for her to amuse herself with. But the guy, with a wave of his hands, said that they couldn't say for sure if she liked her time at home, because she could still change her mind. He smiled and said that after all, the world was very vast and quite interesting, so maybe if she got out of her comfort zone, she would see a lot of new things. Shortly thereafter, everyone finally did come out to escort Annette on his way. David leaned over to the Duchess and said that the Queen's delegation would arrive in the duchy in half a day. The girl was very unhappy about this, but said she understood. She then approached her daughter and inquired if she was ready to go yet. Annette just stood there silent, and her mother took her hand and told her that this place would not be as welcoming as their duchy, so she must take care of herself. The princess looked at her mother with a pitying look and wondered if she might not go there at all. Eloise did not like goodbyes, so she found it very difficult. She couldn't stand it and started yelling at her daughter, telling her to listen to her just this once. Because of all this, there was a very awkward pause between them, and at this she did not understand why her mother had yelled at her so much, and the woman felt ashamed because she had snapped. But after that, the Duchess turned around and started to leave, telling her to take care. After that, everyone got into the wagon, and the Order of the Lion began to leave. Annette looked out of the window for a while longer, accompanied by a glance at all her native servants, who had become her very best friends, as well as her home, in which she had spent a great deal of time. Eloise turned to the rest of the house staff and told them not to worry, for the lady, along with the Order of Lions, would arrive safely, that was for sure. In fact, the woman was incredibly angry. After all, they had never been apart since she was born. She turned to the maid and asked if she thought Annette would hate her after this. The maid, smiling, told her not to worry. It certainly shouldn't happen, for perhaps such a change would even benefit the girl. Annette was riding in the wagon at the same time. She closed the curtains and did not even look out of the window for a while. But after a while of traveling, she got quite bored. So she decided to open the curtains and saw the outside world. The view from the window was unimaginably beautiful, because she could see a small stream that was incredibly clear, mountains that could be seen in the distance, and a large field of fragrant daisies. It was to be an unforgettable journey for Annette, and when she saw all this unimaginable beauty, she was speechless, for she had never seen such a thing in her life. And thus, in the capital with me, the topic of discussion was that the Winchester's daughter had lost her face. Some residents said that she was willful and arrogant, and insulted Her Highness the Queen when they met. Others said that the Queen was pale when she returned, and even the second prince did not want to see her. Another said that the duchy had lost face over the incident, and until she was taught to be independent, she would not participate in any social events. This was rather sad news for the whole community. Some were not surprised at all, for they had not seen the princess since her coming-of-age ceremony. Others said they felt sorry for the girl because she has a pretty face and misses out on so much. Ever since Annette left her ancestral home, no one had heard from her, and many people in Swedish society wondered what she was even doing. The girl herself was still riding in the wagon at that very turn. She had been sleeping peacefully on the seats for some time. However, the road suddenly became very rough, and so the girl began to shake from side to side. She even fell off the seat several times. Soon, Annette could not stand it and knocked, turning to the coachman and asking him to stop. The girl looked pretty awful, for she was very seasick. And soon the carriage stopped, and she went outside to get a little fresh air. The members of the Order of the Lion, immediately seeing her, began to whisper, for she was indeed incredibly beautiful, and they kept saying that this was probably the princess. The girl was quite elegant and very beautifully dressed, but as soon as they saw her expression, they could not understand, since when a carriage ride could have such a terrible effect on even the most beautiful. Annette looked just disgusted. She was incredibly sick and looked like she was about to throw up. Victor suddenly came up to her. He looked serious and asked the coachman why they had stopped suddenly. The man also said that they still had quite a long way to go to the rest stop, and he didn't understand the purpose of doing it in a timely manner. The coachman, bowing, told the captain that it was all because the princess said she couldn't get used to traveling in a carriage, so they decided to stop for her to take a little break. Annette felt a little bad about the whole thing, as she really felt terrible, but she didn't want to hold them back. And as soon as she looked up and saw the very angry expression on Victor's face, she was immediately frightened and ran behind the coachman's back. The captain of the order looked at her in surprise and didn't understand why she was reacting so violently, but he decided not to escalate the situation. So as he turned around, he asked that next time they report it before they had already made their stop. After this, Victor departed, leaving the coachman and poor frightened Annette alone. Arthur approached him from behind and smiled, wondering if maybe he should be a little softer, and also he shouldn't be surprised if people would just hate him in the future. The man looked at his assistant in surprise and asked what he was saying, and Arthur, smiling, asked if he didn't like the princess. Victor replied in a cold voice that of course he didn't. Then the deputy wondered if maybe they had been in love for a long time. But the guy shouted in his face that it wasn't like that, and he shouldn't make these unrealistic theories. And Victor walked over to his horse and began to adjust the seat. He said that the Duchess had simply entrusted him with the care of her daughter for those 2 years, and there was certainly nothing more to it than that. Oh, and on top of all that, the Duchess said before she left that her daughter had been spoiled since she was a baby, so they could feel free to raise her properly. Victor then told the lady that the Order of the Lion mostly accepted extremely vicious people, so it was not appropriate for the princess to be among them. But the woman replied that he just doesn't know her yet, and once they get to know each other better, he'll know right away. Louise explained that she needs someone to support her while she walks, feed her at mealtimes, and take care of her at bath time. She doesn't wear the same outfit twice, and she also throws away food she doesn't like. So Victor sighed heavily and told his assistant that they had to correct her spoiled behavior. Then Arthur concluded for himself that, apparently, he had no chance of any love affair. He was silent for a while, and then reaching closer to the captain, he said that even if that was indeed the case, he still had no reason to be cruel to her. Victor, when he heard this, was very surprised. He looked seriously at his assistant and asked if he was really like that. Arthur couldn't believe that this guy really didn't know what his face was like at times when things didn't go according to plan. But he figured it didn't matter at all. So he decided not to take any chances, because it was none of his business anyway. After all, for the Order of the Lion, the captain's word was like a law. And if he was cold towards Annette, others would not be the first to get close to her either. The girl sat all alone under the tree and only watched the members of the order talking, laughing, and discussing something together. And for someone who has found themselves in the company of complete strangers, this can be a pretty rough time. It had been quite a few hours since then, and it was getting dark outside. So they decided to set up camp in order to rest properly. Soon, when dinner was ready, Hart came over and, taking his plate, said that they had been traveling for a week, so he didn't understand why they hadn't cooked something else. But his friend told him to keep his voice down, because otherwise Fried might hear, and then they would definitely be in trouble. They were not supposed to criticize the food, for it was Frid Gustav who was in charge of the cooking. He was the only wizard in the order, and he mastered the art of cursing. Because of his abilities and fickle moods, he was third on the list of Order of the Lion representatives one would least want to mess with. But nevertheless, Annette didn't stop that, and she stood right behind his back and watched him cook. Soon the boy could not stand it after all. He turned to her and, turning to the lady, asked why she was looking at him so intently. Did she want to have a fight? He was actually very worried, for she had excellent looks and a noble background. A lot of people's hair stood on end just from being around her, but he stayed as far away from her as possible, so he didn't understand why she'd come up to him first. Then he suggested that perhaps she might say that his very existence was poisoning the air and ask him to disappear from this world. Of course he wouldn't want to do that, so he was starting to get very angry and activated his magic. Another of the warriors suddenly ran up to Fried and told her to go as soon as possible, because Fried was at it again. The girl sighed heavily, unable to believe that this was happening again, for it was a rare occurrence. However, the guy at that point had already conjured some kind of circle and told the girl to just disappear with the world. But Leeds came up to them at that moment, who was watching that fight of hers which was going on, for Francis had gone to quiet the fellow. Annette didn't realize for a while what was going on, for she had only come up because she was hungry and had taken food. When she stepped aside somewhere and sat down at the table to begin eating her dinner, but then suddenly a half-beast came to her, and sitting down beside the girl, said that this porridge was made of wild vegetables and dried meat collected nearby. He suggested that she try it, because it was really incredibly delicious. Annette hesitated for a while, but at least she tried it, and as soon as she took the spoon into her mouth, she immediately threw it down. So after it happened, several men came running to the captain, who was having lunch at the time. The man, for his part, was sitting in his large tent, working out a plan of action. Then one of the attendants said that the princess had fainted, so he needed to go to her as soon as possible. As soon as he came closer, the people immediately began to part, because they saw the captain and realized that he had come to deal with the girl. Annette was lying on the ground at this point, and even coughing. She was having a hard time breathing. Her eyes were also closed. The people around her were whispering, not knowing what was going on or whether she was going to be all right. They didn't understand how things could suddenly take such a turn. Some even speculated that someone had poisoned her. But Victor stepped closer to the girl and lifted her torso, apologizing to her. He began to examine her carefully. He touched her stomach with his hand and asked if she had something wrong with it. She said nothing but continued to breathe heavily. Then Victor asked her if she felt hot all over and if it was difficult for her to breathe. But the girl shook her head from side to side. The man immediately realized that she was conscious and had absolutely no signs of poisoning, so he was completely unable to understand what had even happened. Suddenly, she took him by his uniform and said that it was so unpleasant. As soon as Frida heard that his food was just a nuisance, he was ready to pounce on that princess and tear her to shreds because he had tried so hard. But his partners had a hard time stopping him and calming him down. Then Hark spoke up and said that he didn't like the food either. Leeds looked at him in surprise and asked if that was really so. But the boy replied that he would be glad to have some roots, so it was no wonder he liked the food. Then Frances suddenly came up to Victor and asked the captain in a whisper what they should do. She also asked if he wanted them to cook something else for the girl, but the man, getting to his feet, replied that there was no need to do that. Then he turned to Laura, who was his assistant, and asked who was in charge of the hunt that day. She looked at her list and said it was Arthur and Zack. Then Victor asked that she replace them, for the next day he would take the princess hunting. Everyone present was immediately very surprised, but Victor looked at the girl and said that since she didn't want to eat what the others had brought, she would have to conquer what she wanted herself. And the next day, indeed, as the man had said, they went hunting. Annette was given a uniform, as well as a bow and arrow. He planned for her to learn to hunt on her own to make it easier for the girl to survive. And as soon as Annette put on the military uniform which she sewed Frances, she looked just stunning. The girl incredibly fit this clothes. Frances also asked her if she had never worn pants before, because the girl looked uncomfortable in them. And when Annette answered that she had never had to do that before, the girl said that she must be from a noble family and had always followed the rules. But then after looking closely at the uniform, she said it was still a little big in the shoulders. So she asked Annette to sit down and let her adjust it to make it comfortable. The girl sat down immediately, and Frances began to measure something in her shoulders. She said, smiling, that she missed her old clothes incredibly, and added that she hadn't thought they could be of any use to anyone else. Although she had worn it when she was only 13, it had been quite a while since then, and now Frances was very glad she hadn't thrown it away after all. As soon as Annette heard this, she wondered in surprise if she could already hunt at such a wondrous age. Frances was very proud of herself, and said that of course she could, at that age, take down a bear quite tall and powerful. She explained that the winter had been particularly long that year, and all the small animals had been eaten. She still doesn't know where she got her courage from, but in the end she was able to defeat him. Frances was well aware that it was incredibly dangerous, but thanks to her, everyone was able to get full, and they had enough of this bear for the whole winter. She pointed to her chin and said that the scar was from the battle. She smiled and asked the princess if she liked the way it looked. Annette was a little surprised when she said that. She smiled and replied that it did add more masculinity and sternness to her. Frances, seeing the girl's fear, said that she need not worry so much, for as long as the captain was near, everything would be perfectly all right. Victor at that very time had already prepared the horse so that they could go hunting, and Annette came out of the tent after a while, fully dressed in her military uniform. As soon as she approached the man, he immediately held out his hand to help her climb onto the horse. Frances also told the girl one last time that the man would never let her hurt herself while she was around to listen to him. Soon after, they traveled a long way, but soon found themselves deep in the forest. There they were met by a rather steep path downhill. So the man stopped beside her. Then he turned to Annette and said that he was going downstairs, for there might be a pretty good catch. As soon as the girl heard these words, she was immediately frightened and started shaking her head from side to side. He saw this and wondered if she really thought she couldn't go down too. The girl immediately said that of course she couldn't do that. Then he offered an alternative and took her in his arms so that they could go downstairs. Annette felt rather awkward, but because Victor started running very fast, She clung to his neck as best she could to keep from falling. Once they were at the very bottom, the girl continued to sit in his arms, trembling with fear. For a while, Victor just stood there and then wondered if it wasn't enough that he helped her down. You see, Annette wasn't even going to get off his hands. But at that moment, he remembered that she had been spoiled. And when she looked at him with a pitiful look, he knew immediately that she wanted to go down like that again. Victor decided to help her after all, and ran down that slide one more time. The girl was incredibly happy about it, because it was fast and fun. Soon afterward, they decided to take a short rest, for while they had moved away from that mountain, Annette had stumbled many times, and had nearly fallen several times. So Victor immediately poured water into a separate glass for her, and he himself started drinking directly from the bottle. As he watched Annette, he realized that it was not at all surprising that the Duchess of Winchester would rather fight alone than send the girl away. He saw her having fun with the birds and realized that Annette had indeed grown up in hothouse conditions and was completely defenseless against the outside world. Since the Duchess has entrusted him with her protection, it is simply his duty to prepare her for her further dangerous life. At least in those 2 years, he should teach her self-defense skills, so that if she did get into trouble, she would be able to get out of it on her own. Their vacation was over rather quickly, so soon they were on their way. While Annette was walking ahead, she did not notice a snake attacking her from a back branch. But Victor, who was walking behind, managed to react in time and cut off the animal's head. When Annette heard some strange noises, she turned around, but saw nothing and went on her way. The man suggested that he should probably be more strict with her, because that way she could learn everything faster. They walked some more time in the wilderness, and came upon a herd of small fallow deer that were running through. Victor, who was sitting nearby in the bushes in an ambush, managed to react in time when the animal ran past them. He jumped out at it and slit its throat. When the defenseless creature fell to the ground, it was already breathless. But the man, as he got closer, realized that this prey would still not be enough to feed everyone. He decided to hunt something bigger so he could feed the whole company, and it's pretty hardy too. Annette at this point climbed up a tree out of fear because she saw a huge bear approaching the man. However, Victor had very good reactions, so before the bear attacked him, he stuck his sword into its throat. The one immediately died and fell to the ground, and while dripping blood, the girl continued to sit in the tree and just watch everything happen. Victor, meanwhile, began to cut up his prey so that it would fit in his bag. It took him quite a long time, but he managed to get all the animals off the bone, and then he left quietly, unsuspecting. Annette, who continued to sit in the tree, was beginning to fear that she would stay there for the rest of her life. But she was lucky that Victor remembered about her, so he immediately went back and pulled her down from the tree. She was already crying at that point. Slightly calmed down, Victor asked if she remembered what he had just done, and also said that next time she would do it on her own. The girl said nothing to this. He gave her the bow in his hands, and she began to look at it carefully. Victor was alarmed by the fact that she hardly spoke at all. She didn't make a sound now, and he might have forgotten about her. He suggested that the girl might have some kind of problem with her head, and that was why she was taking a rather long time to think. Then he looked around and saw a small pack of animals in a clearing not far from them. He turned to the princess and suggested that she start by practicing a bit before she went to the animals themselves. Of course, Annette didn't mind, so she started pulling the bow on with great difficulty. As soon as Victor noticed it, he assumed that apparently even a woman's bow was too tight for her. So next time he decided to try a beginner's bow for kids. Then he couldn't stand to watch her agonize after all. So he came closer and said that she might hurt herself if she pulled the bowstring hard. So he asked that she let her show for starters. The girl didn't mind. Then he stood beside her and told her to start by spreading her legs shoulder-width apart. She must then draw the bowstring to the level of her mouth, and then release and fire, hitting her opponent. Victor was already a professional, so he hit the deer with the first arrow right in the throat, so it did not even feel the pain, died on the spot. The girl, who had been watching all this intently, was very surprised at how skillfully he managed to do it. But Victor handed her a bow and arrow, and told her that now it was her turn to show what she could learn. When the girl picked up the bow, she was quite scared. However, she was still going to do something. Victor stood behind her and kept giving her instructions. Raise her elbow, don't shake, take deep breaths, and finally calm down. Of course, there were many things he hadn't told her yet, such as the bowstring not being taut enough, her hands shaking, and her breath hitching, which would definitely make it impossible for her to hit the target clearly. Victor realized that these were typical rookie mistakes, but he still felt like she was nervous. Annette fired arrow after arrow, but it kept hitting past the tree it was supposed to stick the arrow in. Soon after a few minutes of practice, she was out of breath because she'd let in almost 10 in a row. When Victor saw this, he immediately walked over to her. She was about to take another arrow and try to shoot it, but he intercepted her arm, stopping her from doing so. He looked rather stern and said that would be enough. If she continued to train like this, there would definitely be no effect. Even as Annette just stood there holding the arrow, Victor noticed that her hand was shaking so much that it meant she was incredibly worried. Moving closer to her, he took her shaking hand and wondered why she was so nervous. The girl answered nothing to this for a while. Then she looked at him in surprise and asked, "Is he really saying that she is nervous?" Victor immediately assumed that he had imagined it, to which she replied that she didn't know what he meant, and added that she hoped to succeed as soon as possible. And it's all because he's contentedly strong and good at absolutely everything. He has a broad outlook, ability, courage, and experience. All of this has been honed by decades of hard work. He's completely different from someone like her. That's why she admitted that sometimes she can't help but think about it. The girl said she would be very curious. What would have happened if she had been as strong as he was? Perhaps she wouldn't even be a burden to her own mother. When Victor heard this confession, he was incredibly badly struck. He did not expect that a girl could say such words, so for a while, he did not even know how to react to it. Then after thinking it over, he walked closer to her and took her hand and told her it was quite normal. In fact, he was incredibly surprised that she could actually speak normally. And it was all because it was the first time he'd heard her say such a long sentence in all the past weeks. And for a moment, he didn't even know what to do. Before, she spoke all the time in separate words, and it even seemed to him that she didn't know how to construct long and complete sentences. Well, seeing how sad Annette was, he continued to hold her hand and said he first picked up a knife when he was 6 years old. His target was not beasts or any monsters, but specifically humans. That long winter the crops withered and the livestock froze to death. Some starving people attacked living children, sometimes even their own. They didn't hesitate to kill them. And then they ate them. But Victor had to save his little brother and kill his father. He's killed a lot of disgusting people with his own hands over the years, and he still feels that knife in his hand sometimes. Most of the members of the Order of Lions have a very similar past. They've all been in danger. They've been made stronger by their ordeals. After all, absolutely no one would want to be homeless their whole lives. So they found each other and became a huge family. Victor, smiling, stroked her head, comforting her, and said that it was not at all her fault that she had been born into a rich family and lived in comfort. She had no need to be ashamed of such things. He said she didn't need to be strong to protect the people she cared about. Only when she has someone to protect can she become stronger. Fixing her hair out of her face, he said she could certainly trust him that this day was just around the corner. And as soon as, and at that, I saw that sparkling smile and thought about all his words, I was directly inspired by it all. She grabbed Victor by the sleeve and looked at him with her beautiful gaze and wondered, if anything, what she could do for them right now. The man was a little surprised at how sincerely she said it, and realized that his words really hadn't been said in vain. So he, trying to keep his joyful emotions in check, suggested picking more fruit and already heading back. Stepping aside, they found a fruit tree, and he set the girl up on top of it. Annette, meanwhile, managed to pick a few apples and peaches. When the girl reached down, she was able to find some rainbow mushrooms, which of course were inedible and even poisonous. But most of all, they were hallucinogenic. So Victor tactfully hinted to her that it was better not to take them, and took her to the bush, on which grew more berries. The man stood aside, and the girl meanwhile tried to tear off a few leaves in order to get at the berries themselves. But eventually, with a lot of effort, she was able to pluck it right off the root and pulled out a whole bush of these berries. Because she was using a lot of force, she couldn't even stay on her feet and would have fallen. But Victor managed to run up and catch her in time. Annette was happier than ever, and he could see her smile for the first time in a very long time. When evening began to fall, They had already returned from their hunt, and dinner was finally ready. As soon as the members of the order saw this beautiful fruitcake, as well as many things meaty, they were just thrilled with it. When Frances tasted a piece of this pie, she said it was incredible that Annette picked these berries herself. But then suddenly Fried's voice was heard, who also took a taste of the pie and wondered why they were suddenly digging up sweet potatoes. He looked rather stern and said that right now it was still bitter and unripe, so the good meat was just spoiled. Afterward, he looked at Annette and smiled happily at the fact that he had been able to insult her food. Frances, when she heard this, was incredibly angry. She couldn't believe that he could do such a despicable thing to the princess. Annette was incredibly upset. She moved closer to the man and he was startled, asking what she was doing. The girl looked at him with a pitying look and asked, "Is it really so unpalatable?" Fried became too uncomfortable, and Annette kept repeating time after time, "Does it really taste disgusting? Is it even impossible to eat?" And she made incredibly cute and pitiful eyes. Soon he gave in and said that it wasn't that it was horrible, but that everyone around him was very surprised when they heard it. He had never said that before. Annette was also incredibly excited. She wanted to run up to him and hug him, but the man stepped away from her and told her not to come near him in any way. Arthur, who was standing on the sidelines with his commander watching this, was very surprised and didn't understand if it was really worth getting so excited over this trifle. And Victor, as he watched the girl begin to move closer to the team, even smiled and realized he didn't hate her. The next morning, Victor, as usual, slept late in his tent, you see, all night and all night long studying the terrain. However, rather early on he was awakened by some noise going on outside, and upon waking up he was very displeased and wondered what they had going on in the first place. Hark, who was passing him with a huge barrel, inquired if he would like some tea made, and also wished the captain a good morning. Victor replied that he didn't need to brew anything, and looked at the cheering crowd of his team and wondered what was even going on. At the same time, Annette was sitting in a huge tent and tasting various dishes. She said that some of them were not tasty, while others were not bad, and could even be eaten. The boy explained to the commander that at first he just wanted to cook something delicious for the princess, but in the end, she had a hard time last night eating sweet potato pie, because it wasn't tasty to her, and he doesn't know why or how. But eventually a competition began among all of their team. They brought her different dishes to please her. He also explained to Victor that they would all deal with the leftover food together, so nothing would be thrown away, so they could not worry about spoiled food. When Arthur saw it, he said that even if that was the case, still so much food in the middle of the day was just outrageous. Then, suddenly Frances's voice was heard saying that they had wine made from gugu fruit, and as soon as the boy heard that, he immediately ran up to them and said that he wanted to try it too. He was no longer embarrassed by the fact that they were transferring so much food and getting full before they left. And Annette, when she heard about this fruit, was very surprised and asked what it was. Frances explained that it was a juice that tasted like alcohol. However, it doesn't make you drunk at all. The best time to drink it is in the morning. Victor watched in amazement. It had taken him a whole year to join the group and become their leader, and Annette had been able to communicate well with them in just a couple of evenings. The guy just couldn't believe it, because for quite some time even Frances didn't trust him. But at that moment he noticed that Annette was poured a full mug of this wonderful juice. And Victor could not believe that only the day before yesterday she began to join their team, and here she was already accepted as a native. He stood aside like a stone, watching everything that was going on. The man even thought that he would be unnecessary. But Annette, when she saw him standing all alone and sad, immediately ran up to him. She took her plate of food with her, and holding out some fruit to him, offered to eat together. When Victor saw this, he was very amazed. He couldn't believe that she had actually brought food for him. It was very nice. But as soon as he read the name of the dish on the plate, namely assorted roast pork, it surprised him very much, for there was absolutely not a single piece of meat in it, but only vegetables. He stared at the princess and wondered where all the meat had gone. Annette immediately became uncomfortable, because of course she herself had eaten all the pieces of meat and left only vegetables on the plate. Victor suggested that she move away from the people for a while. Everyone immediately began to watch this and was very surprised, but did not go after them. When the man and the girl were alone, He started swearing loudly at her and told her to eat vegetables too. Victor poked some broccoli on his fork and told her not to be so selective. He started to feed her, and Annette tried to resist. When the rest of the team heard some strange sounds, they immediately went to see what kind of drama was going on. They were incredibly excited and enjoyed watching it all. Fried was the only one who wasn't happy and, mocking him, asked how many second-rate novels they had read. But then suddenly Hark spoke up, saying that he'd actually had some sort of bad feeling all along. He turned to his friends and said that even though the members of the order had accepted the princess, it was hard to say how the people in the camp would react. When the others thought about it, they realized that his words actually made sense. Arthur, who continued to sip his alcohol-flavored drink, hesitated and said that Cassandra was definitely not going to give up. But shortly afterward, toward lunchtime, they packed up again and set out at last. Annette lay in her carriage and rested peacefully, for the whole day in the sun had made her very tired. Of course, she didn't get a good night's sleep for long, because the road began to toss the whole carriage from side to side again. At this time, Arthur and Victor were riding behind, and the boy said that if nothing else happened, at this rate they could reach their destination in 2 days. But Victor was very serious, and said that they were completely unaware of these lands, so they should not relax for a single minute. Suddenly he turned his head to the side and saw far away from him, on the mountain behind a rock, some silhouette. It was the man who had been following their group. As soon as Victor turned around, he immediately hid behind a rock. The man was very wary and could not understand what it was, but suddenly they heard a strange sound. A huge stone was thrown at them with a rope. As soon as the people realized this, they immediately rushed to retreat, realizing that they were under attack. A huge boulder flew down the mountain at a tremendous speed straight at them. Annette, who had fallen asleep on the floor by then, suddenly heard strange shouts. They said to prepare to repel an attack, and there were many sharp sounds. But as soon as the girl woke up, she suddenly felt someone grabbing her arm. Miraculously, she managed to pick up her suitcase. When she opened her eyes, she saw that she was flying straight from the carriage that had exploded. The girl was puzzled by what was happening, but saw Victor in front of her, who pressed her to his chest and began to cover her with his cloak, so that the shards from the stone did not get on her. As soon as everything had calmed down, they remained seated in the clearing. Francis, who was very excited, ran up to them and asked if everyone was all right. Victor, covering Annette with his cloak, stepped aside and asked Francis to take care of her. The girl immediately ran over to the princess and began to help her up, and their commander by then, wiping the blood from his mouth, began to walk away. As soon as Francis lifted the girl onto her shoulders, she realized that it was quite dangerous. If the captain was even a second late, things could end very badly. She set off and really hoped that Annette wasn't so badly frightened that she suddenly shouted that she saw enemies that could be hiding everywhere. But at that moment, as Francis turned, she saw some bandit flying at them. He was shouting at them and saying that they must die. Annette managed to react in time and hit him hard on the head several times with her large suitcase. Soon afterward, the boy could no longer even stand up, and Francis moved Annette to the other side. She was surprised at how quickly the girl was able to react.